Riddle me this, Batman, was the signature phrase of a supervillain dressed in green opposing a caped Crusader in a DC comic strip. And one of the most dominant issues in a presidential election year concerns what has been called a zoonotic evolution of a bat coronavirus that emerged in an open-air market in the central mainland of China that represents a major public health concern for 85% of Democrats, but only 43% of Republicans, but which 40% of Americans, 57% of African Americans and Latinos, 46% of Asians, and 33% of Caucasians actually perceive as a direct and personal threat to their health and safety. And in that DC comic strip, the Riddler, the Joker, the Penguin, the Catwoman, Mr. Freeze, and other supervillains at the end of each episode hope to finally discover the identity of the crime-fighting Cape Crusader in the dynamic duo, the millionaire philanthropist Bruce Wayne, who for years concealed a bat cave below his mansion estate and had a bat phone to call Commissioner Gordon and Chief O'Hara to assist their efforts in crime fighting, a commendably noble cause, for which we daily tuned in at the same bat time in the same bat channel. My name is Major Mike Webb, a retired military intelligence officer. I have worked in special operations, combat arms, tactical battalions, and in strategic echelon above corps counterintelligence. Although my daddy was a preacher, his best friend was a pretty famous criminal defense attorney, and you may have heard of some of his clients, and consequently a pretty frequent Sunday dinner guest. I grew up just across the river from Manhattan in the shadow of the World Trade Center, and during the summer of the Son of Sam killing spree, one of the first lessons of criminal law that became very clear was that the press does not always get it right. But since most receive their information about the world from the news, that sets off a ripple effect of consequences in how we perceive the world and our environment. Consequently, when I became a lieutenant assigned to strategic counterintelligence on Fort Meade and had to stand up the counterintelligence operations cell to respond to the Oklahoma City bombing, it was not entirely a surprise to discover that in military-related events, the press does not always get it right there either, for whatever reason. While there is a lot of mixed concerns regarding a novel coronavirus, according to the most recent report from the Pew Research Center, almost 90% of Americans agree that it represents a major threat to our nation's economy. But for only 40% of Americans does the pandemic pathogen that has indelibly altered our way of life perceived as a personal physical threat to health or life, which is of significance because the personal fears of a minority have altered the lives of everyone, and arising from a public health concern that has yet to present a mortality rate that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, would recognize as a local epidemic anywhere, falling far below the 6.7% threshold. And in a presidential election year, it is significant that, according to the Pew Research Center, 85% of Democrats perceive a novel coronavirus as a major public health threat to the nation, while only 46% of Republicans would agree. But still, 45% of Republicans would agree and acknowledge that it is at least a minor public health threat or concern. So, for the next few minutes, we will explore what may be a new term for many with regard to a novel coronavirus, a theory regarding the zoonotic evolution of a novel coronavirus from a bat coronavirus in the People's Republic of China that erupted in Wuhan, the 43rd largest city in the world, and located within the Hubei province in the central mainland. The first stop on this exploratory tour is a review of basic high school math and science. And as you may recall, viruses were not discovered until the 19th century because they are so very small. And it is simply a single strand of RNA wrapped by a membrane. Very small. They represent the smallest biological particles, but they are also the most abundant biological particle in the world. And that is the basic science of it. But the sheer size of the sample universe dictates, by function of the probability and statistics, that this should be an unstable population, subjected to multiple permutations and combinations, if you recall those. But until 2010, there were only 219 viruses known to be harmful to man, including SARS, which erupted in Hong Kong in what has been called a zoonotic evolution from a bat coronavirus, as well as MERS, which has been alleged also to be a zoonotic evolution from a bat coronavirus. And coronaviruses are both the largest of viruses and the largest family of viruses, about which scientists have known for over 60 years, which caused some confusion when a novel coronavirus suddenly emerged, because some may have seen coronaviruses mentioned on a can of Lysol or on the fact sheet listing the 4 common coronaviruses that was published by the CDC. And so despite a recent flurry of activity among coronaviruses over the past 2 decades suddenly emerging, it does yet remain plausible that zoonotic evolution occurs in nature. The most often cited research report regarding the origins of a novel coronavirus was published by Scripps Research in April 2020, and it states near the outset that SARS-CoV-2 is the 7th coronavirus known to infect humans. SARS-CoV, MERS-CoV, and SARS-CoV-2 can cause severe disease, whereas HKU1, NL63, OC43, and 229E are associated with mild symptoms. It is of note that the CDC also states that none of these coronaviruses have a cure. But that study set out to review what can be deduced about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 from comparative analysis of genomic data, and they offered a perspective on the notable features of the SARS-CoV-2 genome and discussed scenarios by which they could have arisen. They concluded that their analysis clearly shows that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus, and that since they had observed all notable SARS-CoV-2 features, including the optimized RBD, that stands for recombinant binding domain, and polybasic cleavage site in related coronaviruses in nature, they did not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible. However, Christian Anderson, the author of that study, added the important caveat that more scientific data could swing the balance of evidence to favor one hypothesis over the other. With any form of persuasive communication, the author is trying to convince you about something or sell you something, and when a caveat is provided, it is like those warnings and indications that you may find on a medical prescription, prompting you to be aware that even if the argument advanced is valid and logical, there may be some other practical considerations for you that may alter that conclusion. But it is also an opportunity for the author to continue his persuasion effort by orienting your critique towards what the author considers important from a biased perspective. And that is not necessarily sinister standing alone, because it may arise simply from one's professional disciplinary perspective. For instance, by experience and training, I am a tactical and strategic military intelligence analyst. Accordingly, what I may consider to be of significance may not be important to a scientist simply attempting to describe a medical phenomenon. We have very different questions and concerns that we need to address and answer. And so the only question with which they were concerned to determine whether or not a novel coronavirus zoonotically evolved from a bat coronavirus, was whether or not simply through natural selection and mutations a virus might plausibly or possibly be able to replicate this transaction either through development in an infected bat or possibly later after attacking a human host. And despite authoritatively stating that we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible, the only definitive statement advanced in support of this conclusion is that SARS-CoV-2 may bind human ACE2 with high affinity. Computational analysis predicts that the interaction is not ideal and that the RBD sequence is different from those shown in SARS-CoV to be optimal for receptor binding. Thus, the high affinity binding of SARS-CoV-2 spike protein to human ACE2 is most likely the result of natural selection on a human or human-like ACE2 that permits another optimal binding solution to arise. There's strong evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is not the product of purposeful manipulation. The study, however, failed to find any evidence to support any conclusions at all regarding the gain of function at the cleavage site. And this study has prompted a rash of research about the recombinant binding domain as well as the ACE2 receptors. But the rationale for the Scripps research conclusion was that it had to be natural evolution because if the targeting capabilities of a novel coronavirus had been created in a laboratory, they would have been far more efficient. Not satisfied with the idea of a military weapon or equipment being good enough for government work. So shifting gears from being instant scientists, the concept of being good enough for government work recurred frequently for myself throughout a military career spanning 2 decades. And back in 1996, when I served as principal staff officer involved in the creation of the intelligence agency that ABC News reported in April was supposed to have alerted the president back in November about a public health concern in Wuhan, I had a Wang computer good enough for government work at my desk. And you were considered to be very fortunate indeed if you had a Netscape browser on it. But wearing multiple hats, even during that assignment, the concept of gain-of-function research should raise interest for anyone engaged in government contracting, sole source justification statements, and drafting specifications for procurement. And beyond over 35 anomalies that we have already identified in the migration patterns of this virus, or path of generation, as we say, that cannot be simply explained away under general principles of virology and epidemiology, it is specifically those enhanced capabilities of a novel coronavirus that are of a national security concern and interest, the most important of which was not even discussed in this foundational study by Scripps Research or any other major work since, despite publication as late as April. Particularly the anomalous presence of a human immune deficiency virus component within the genomic sequence of a novel coronavirus that is alleged to have evolved zoonotically from a bat, as reported by Business Insider in January, as the world was first being introduced to a novel coronavirus that would not be raised to the level of a public health emergency of international concern until January 30th. And one which the World Health Organization had believed could still be contained on January 31st. In discussion of the unresolved cleavage site phenomenon, the Scripps Research report does make reference to O-linked glycans creating a mucin-like domain to aid in human immune evasion, but not the enhanced capability or gain of function that enabled a novel coronavirus to equip itself with a means to specifically attack the human immune system. Serving in the same capacity as a flash or concussion grenade that might be used by light infantry soldiers involved in close quarter combat to breach a door and enter a room harboring hostile forces. Is it possible, or even plausible that simply in nature a virus specifically targeted at specific human cells developed in nature with characteristics that enabled it to function like a special operations soldier? Perhaps. Is it possible or plausible that the gain of function that enabled a novel coronavirus to both attack a human respiratory cell specifically and simultaneously degrade the human immune system was simply overlooked in the scientific research that has even engaged for months various researchers, including the World Health Organization, on research testing the efficacy of non-medical grade masks, something that we had established in 2010 by a study conducted by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Perhaps. But at the beginning of July, 239 scientists from around the world presented a research paper unprecedentedly to the World Health Organization to assert that they had found substantial evidence to validate a part of a theory that we had proposed to both Senator Mark Warner and the World Health Organization at the end of March, that the virus is not being transmitted from person to person through talking, coughing, or sneezing, but rather being transmitted primarily as an aerosol. Particles less than 5 microns. And I am not a scientist, just a retired biological warfare planner. My name is Major Mike Webb, retired Army Ranger, and I am running for U.S. Congress. With liberty, honor, and excellence, by God, we shall make America great again. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.